I'm going to talk about Nurse, a character from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. These are just some ideas of what you might want to explore about this character should a question come up about her in the exam. So firstly, we are continually reminded of the fact that she is a servant of the Capulet household, and specifically she is an employee of Lord Capulet, because she is often referred to as Nurse rather than her name, and we'll come to the question of what her name is later on in this video. So the fact that she is an employee of Lord Capulet, as well as this confidant to Juliet, creates conflict, and we should know that conflict is a central theme in this play. So it could be argued that she fails to balance these two roles, and that's what helps lead to the tragic ending. Okay, does she, in many, I'm sure we'll see this more times than not in this play, that she behaves more like a friend or a confidant to Juliet than she does an employee of Lord Capulet. And right at the end, we see that change where she obeys Lord Capulet's desire for Juliet to marry Paris and encourages Juliet to do that in the end. But it's too late by then. So is it this failure of hers to really kind of manage this balance of being an employee and having these feelings of friendship, or more than that, of motherhood towards Juliet, which creates this tragedy? It's something definitely to explore. Bearing in mind her position as a employed woman in the Elizabethan times, at this time there were comparatively few employment opportunities for women than there were for men. As an example, you couldn't be a lawyer if you were a woman. So there are only certain roles open to women, and women were really discouraged to work. So the nurse's livelihood would depend on her complete obedience to her employer, Lord Capulet. And I mention this now because later on we're going to talk about when the nurse encourages Juliet to marry Paris in the end. And often that is described as a great betrayal. She's now putting herself first instead of Juliet. And personally, I think that's unfair, because we're talking about a woman who lives in a time where if she wants to be able to feed herself and survive, she needs to obey her employer, because there wouldn't be that many opportunities for the nurse out there. So keep that in mind, but we'll come back to this idea later. So we've already mentioned this, the fact that she is this maternal role or maternal figure to Juliet. When we first see the nurse, she refers to Juliet in pet names, Lamb, Ladybird. So these pet names reveal that she views Juliet as innocent and in need of her protection and guidance like a child. This could also be linked to the nurse's potential name, which we believe is potentially Angelica, because it's what Lord Capulet calls her in Act 3, Scene 5. So that would certainly be accepted in an exam, that potentially her name is Angelica, which could symbolise her role as a guardian angel to Juliet. Now, what you could raise there, especially later when we look at the fate of Juliet, does she fail as her guardian angel? Because, she leads her to marry Romeo, and that leads to Juliet's suicide. She knows Juliet so well, so much so that she knows her down to the hour, according to the nurse. So this hyperbolic claim emphasises how much she dotes on Juliet, as if she were her mother. And this contrasts with Lady Capulet in the scene, who actually can't recall how old Juliet is. So that obviously highlights that Juliet is much closer to the nurse than she is her own mother. Look at the way that she speaks to Romeo when really acting as the messenger to determine how they will marry and what will happen. And she says, if you should deal double with her. Her warning to Romeo highlights her protectiveness over Juliet, much like how a mother might feel the need to protect her daughter. And I find this really interesting in Act 3, Scene 5, when she stands up to Lord Capulet. Okay, when, if you recall, he's saying things like he's calling Juliet a baggage. He's saying that she's going to die on the streets. He'll have nothing to do with her if she doesn't marry Paris. So her direct criticism of Lord Capulet presents her as Juliet's protector in this instance. It greatly juxtaposes with the expectations of a servant to be obedient to her employer. So, you know, she's really putting her neck out on the line here, and she has done in many ways up to this point in helping Juliet and going against the desires of Lord Capulet. And she definitely, again, contrasts with Lady Capulet, who echoes her husband's sentiment by saying, I have done with thee. So Lady Capulet supports her husband in this instance and doesn't think about Juliet and her feelings. The nurse does. But of course that changes very quickly in this scene, which we'll come to later. And then when the nurse thinks she has found Juliet's dead body, of course the audience know different, that this is a fake death. She says, never was seen so black a day as this. So this dark imagery is used to stress the nurse's grief over her loss, as if she has lost her own daughter. You might go on there to say that this is dramatic irony. We know what's happened more than the nurse, and that indicates actually that her relationship isn't as close as at this point as it was at the beginning of the play when Juliet told the nurse everything. So keeping this in context, you might think that this relationship is rather unusual, but actually children of wealthy families during the Elizabethan times would be raised by nannies or governesses and would often have more of a formal relationship with their mothers. So what you see actually with this bond with Juliet and the nurse wouldn't have been as uncommon as you may think. She also focuses on the physical element of love, and that creates this really wonderful contrast between her and Juliet, and is really used to pronounce the spiritual love of Romeo and Juliet. So she says, seek happy nights to happy days. You can just read that as her saying, you know, go and find a happy life. But you could also, and especially knowing how crude the nurse can be, you can definitely read this instead as a sexual innuendo, revealing that the nurse wants Juliet to not only have a happy life, but to have sexual fulfillment as well. And she certainly sees this as an important part of love because she often refers to sex. As an example, she says, but you shall bear the burden soon at night. This is Act 2, Scene 5, coming up to the wedding. So she's really talking about the honeymoon and consummating that marriage. And so she's alluding to Juliet having sex. So the double entendre here means both that Juliet will have to work hard to please her man, you might say, with this being the kind of sexist view of a woman having to please her husband, but also that she has to literally bear the weight of Romeo on top of her. So that's really bawdy and really lewd, if you like. But the bawdiness of the nurse draws a parallel with Mercutio's character. We've certainly seen this type of talk from Mercutio as well. Haven't written it here, but it also contrasts her with Romeo and Juliet, who have this really spiritual love and do not talk in that matter. They talk on a much deeper level. His face be better than any man's. Of course, she's here talking about Romeo. She talks about his leg excelling all men's, hand, foot, body, and they are all past compare. So she's saying he's a really good looking chap. So isn't that interesting? Just before Juliet marries Romeo, the nurse is basically saying, yeah, he's really good looking. Like, that's enough. Okay, so she seems quite a shallow character, and again focusing on the physical part of love and physical attraction rather than thinking about a deeper connection, which we've seen between Romeo and Juliet. So her focus on Romeo's physical attributes makes her a dramatic foil to Juliet, who is much more concerned with the spirit of their love and that emotional connection that they have. You might even analyse this a bit further and think about the fact that she's actually looking Romeo up and down, because she starts with his face, and then she goes to his leg, so she's looking down again, and then she goes to the hand, and then she goes down to the foot. And so she's constantly looking him up and down, okay? So again, highlights the shallowness of the nurse for certain, but the real aim for that is to pronounce the spiritual love of Romeo and Juliet. So, you know, that's I don't think that's something that would be frowned upon by the Elizabethan audience, okay? Although the notion of romantic love was gaining popularity during the Elizabethan period, it was considered something separate to marriage. So although she communicates this in a lewd way, the nurse's focus on procreation is very much reflects the importance placed on it during this time, okay? So, she's often talking about sex, but it would have been seen as something really important because, a marriage, especially a wealthy marriage, they'd want that legacy to continue through creating heirs or an heir to their money, basically, to their land, to their titles. So it was really important. A lot of importance would have been placed on that, not just by the nurse. She's certainly comedic, okay? She's there to make the audience laugh. But it's an uncomfortable laugh sometimes, especially, I think, maybe for a modern audience. So here she says, "Thou wilt fall backward when thou hast more wit." So she's talking about Juliet falling over when she was younger and repeating a joke that her late husband actually said, that, well, when you're older, you'll learn to fall backwards, and that's really referring or alluding to the fact that you'll learn to fall backwards and have sex. The nurse's humour comes from speaking extensively, repeatedly and inappropriately. So this is clearly inappropriate. It's extensive because it's part of a monologue, actually, where she's talking at great lengths and won't shut up. And she actually says this twice. So that's where the comedy comes from her. She doesn't really have much self-awareness. And so it becomes quite a uncomfortable situation, but funny to watch. She also gets her words mixed up, and that really highlights her class and level of education, and therefore her class. So when you get your words mixed up, it's called a malapropism, which is here. So here she should have said, "I desire some conference with you," but she says, "I desire some confidence," because, she's in front of people from a higher class, so she's probably trying to present herself in a different light and pretend that she's a bit more educated than she actually is and use a bit fancier words than she normally would, but she gets it wrong. So it's really there to add humour to the play. Her level of humour comes from her misunderstanding of language, which contrasts to Mercutio. So even though there's a parallel drawn between them with the way that they look at love in this physical way and how crude they can be, the way they use words is totally different. Remember that Mercutio is very witty and incredibly intelligent and creative with the way that he uses words. It's the opposite for the nurse. She's in contrast to Mercutio in that way, in the sense that actually it's the fact that she doesn't know how to use words correctly, and she's not very imaginative and creative, that creates that humour. She speaks in blank verse also, that represents her class. That doesn't just emphasise her class, but also her comedic role. Thinking about Act 2, Scene 5, this is a really comedic scene as well. Just to remind you, it starts with Juliet impatiently waiting for the nurse to come back from her meeting with Romeo to see if she's actually going to get married. And so she's there, anxious to find out, can't wait. And the nurse turns up and really prolongs this moment by saying things like, "Oh, I'm out of breath, I can't talk. Oh, rub my back. Oh." And she's really dramatic about it. So her melodramatic dialogue adds to the comedy and the tension of the scene. And right at the end, she finally reveals that Juliet will get married. What's important to note here is she is a form of comic relief, but that actually ends after Mercutio's death. And so that helps also shift the tone of the play. Many people argue that Romeo and Juliet is 2 scenes of comedy and 2 acts of comedy and 3 acts of tragedy, and she helps that. So she's very comedic in those first 2 acts. We won't see that comedic side from her in Act 3 and onwards. She's also the facilitator of Romeo and Juliet's love alongside Friar Lawrence. They're the only 2 people who know about this, other than obviously Romeo and Juliet themselves. As an example, she says, "I must another way to fetch a ladder" in Act 2, Scene 4. She's saying this to Romeo, basically saying, "I'll make it so that, 1, not only will you get married, but you can also go into Juliet's room after the the wedding so that you can consummate your marriage. In other words, you can have sex. So the nurse literally offers a way for the young lovers to be together by saying, I'm going to get a rope ladder to her room. But also figuratively, she helps pave the way, not only pave the way to each other, but to their deaths. Because of course, this is linked to the prologue. We know that them being together, it's written in the stars, it's a death-marked love. There's no other way for them to go but to their suicides. And she helps pave the way to that. Also coming back to this idea that her name potentially is Angelica, the Greek meaning of Angelica is messenger. And so that's obviously part of her role. Without her passing messages from Juliet to Romeo, they would not have been able to organise this union. It's important to note, though, although she shares this role of facilitator with Friar, they do contrast by the end of the play. The nurse fails to take the relationship seriously and then encourages Juliet to marry Paris. In contrast, the Friar produces a plan for Juliet to fake her own death. So it suggests that the Friar actually understands the relationship on a deeper level, much more so than the nurse. And you could link that to the fact that the Friar is a religious man and therefore a spiritual man, and is able to comprehend that level of love, unlike the nurse. That's one way of arguing that. She's incredibly pragmatic though at times, okay, thinking about the way she talks about marriage, and especially at the end when she encourages Juliet to, you know what, forget about Romeo, you're just going to have to marry Paris. So first of all, on talking about the prospect of marrying Paris, she says women grow by men. The metaphor here refers to not only the improved social status that Paris will offer Juliet, so growing in status, but also the fact that she will become pregnant, but also the wifely duty of procreation. Remember, she's focused again on procreation, so quite pragmatic in the way that she looks at marriage. It's a way to improve your social status, and it's a way to procreate and create an heir and a legacy. You know not how to choose a man. So she's talking here about Romeo, despite the fact that she says he's a good-looking chap and he's a nice person. She's saying you do not know how to choose a match for yourself. And that's because Paris is a member of the nobility, and he's going to improve Juliet's social status. It would be a step up for Juliet because she's a member of a mercantile family, not a member of the nobility. So she's again looking at this match in practical ways. And then eventually she tells Juliet, I think it best you marry the county. This reveals the nurse is neither concerned with morality or legality, but entirely focused on practicality. Juliet sees this as a great betrayal, calling her a wicked fiend. But has the nurse failed Juliet? Here's something that you can critically analyse. Has she failed Juliet in saying that? Because if Juliet had followed that advice, Juliet would still be alive and Romeo would still be alive potentially. So is she saying that because she's betraying Juliet, or is she saying it to protect her and thinking, you know what, there's no feasible way of avoiding this marriage, you're just going to have to marry him, and the best thing for you to do is forget about Romeo? So it's something to think about rather than just simply saying it's a betrayal. I read that a lot from students. Think about an examiner. They're going to be reading, 500 different responses, if not more. Really critically analyse that. I think that's too simple of a reading. And really think about, what if you were in the nurse's position and you felt that loyalty to Juliet? Okay, you'd want what's best for her and what's safe for her, and in this instance it would have been better, or at least safer, for Juliet to have married the Paris, even if it was illegal. So think about the context of the time. Okay, it was typical to look at marriage in a practical way. Marriage to the wealthy was a way to manage social status, if not improve it, and maintain social status and financial security. As a female and someone of lower class, keep this in mind, the nurse is not able to create change. Her advice to marry Paris might be viewed as a betrayal, but it reflects the limited power a woman in the nurse's position has in changing the status quo. So is this really a betrayal or a reflection on the fact that the nurse has never ever enjoyed power in her life? So why on earth would she think of it being possible that Juliet as a woman would be able to change anything and truly go against her father's wishes? So here are some ideas. I've actually missed one of these out, so I'm going to mention it in a moment, so apologies. So the function, remember, always think about, why did Shakespeare create these characters? There would be a bigger message that he would have wanted to carry out through that character, or he wants to use that character to progress the plot of the play in some way. So she's a catalyst because she helps move Romeo and Juliet's relationship on, doesn't she? She helps she facilitates their marriage. She's comic relief. She provides much needed relief of that tension that comes with a tragedy. So she's very important, because otherwise it'd be far too intense of a play to watch. It'd be too uncomfortable to watch as a member of the audience. So you need that comic relief that we have in Mercutio, but also in the nurse. She's also a symbol of the status quo, as we've just talked about. In the end, she gives in and she follows the desires of Lord Capulet. Okay, there's something to say there about people who are weak in that society, and for this we're talking about the nurse being of lower class and also being a woman. She's not used to going against the social grain because she's in this powerless situation. Does she create a contrast then for Juliet? Because Juliet does say, you know what, the only power I have is to die, and I'm willing to do that. So Juliet kind of really takes on the status quo and challenges it in some respects. I want what I want and I'm going to get it, and if I can't get it, I'd rather die. So she kind of uses all the power that she has, whereas the nurse feels powerless. The other thing that I should have written here is she does help pronounce the spirituality between Romeo and Juliet and their love through her bawdiness. So talking about the physical part of love and always being crude, talking about sex, helps us appreciate how special and how spiritual Romeo and Juliet's love is as well. So she's used for that reason as well. I just forgot to put it on this slide. As always, I'd love for you to share your own thoughts. Please share your ideas in the comment section. These are just some suggestions, and this is just my interpretation. The wonderful thing about literature is you don't have to agree. So feel free to write your own thoughts in the comment section.